The sun was already burning the earth by mid-morning, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and the dirt roads crumble into ribbons of dust. And in that kind of world, there was a man named Eli Morgan. He was a veteran, a man who had fought wars on battlefields and then lost the war at home. His wife had passed, his ranch had withered in the drought, and all he had left was silence. The kind of silence that eats you alive if you let it. That day, Eli didn't ride into town to look for anything more than rope, flour, maybe a trace of hope, if such a thing was still being sold. But the town square was loud with something else entirely. An auction. Not cattle, not horses, children. And if you've ever been in a place where cruelty is made casual, you know the sound. It's sharp, it's hollow, it makes you wonder how people can cheer while someone's soul is being priced out like a sack of grain. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd. Strong back, no-node sickness, 12 years old, don't talk much, but doesn't need to. What she lacks in words, she makes up for in grit. And then a small girl walked up onto the block, barefoot, hair tangled into a braid that looked like it had been tied and untied 100 times. Her clothes hung off her body, torn and too big. And yet her eyes looked out over the crowd like storm clouds. Not crying, not trembling, just ancient. The kind of eyes that carry more years than the body holding them. Eli felt something twist in his gut. He hadn't felt that since the war, the kind of pull that says, this moment will change you if you let it. The bidding started. $10, $15. Eli's voice came out before he even knew it belonged to him. $20, $25. His jaw tightened. He hadn't bought anything in years, not since the ranch had dried up, not since grief had stolen the taste from every coin. But now his voice was steady. Stronger. 30. The other man spat and gave up. And just like that, the gavel cracked like thunder. Sold to Mr. Eli Morgan. Here's the thing. I don't think Eli meant to buy her. Not in the way the others meant. He wasn't looking for a servant or a burden or even redemption. But sometimes life doesn't ask what you meant. Sometimes it puts a mirror in front of you, and you see what you're really capable of. Have you ever had that? A moment where you acted before you even thought, and later realized it wasn't chance at all, it was choice. They rode home in silence, the girl behind him on his old Mustang, her eyes fixed on the horizon like maybe it could hand her back something she had lost. Eli tried to break the silence, asked her name. Nothing. He sighed. I'll call you Clara then. Not all right? She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, just stared ahead. Clara. It wasn't just a name. It was his daughter's name. The one he had lost long ago when grief had turned him into a man who cut ties rather than risk the pain of losing again. Naming this girl Clara wasn't coincidence. It was instinct. Maybe even a second chance he didn't know he was asking for. When they reached his ranch, the land stretched out tired and brittle, fields like bone, fences chewed up by time, a barn that leaned west as if it were too weary to stand straight. He helped her down, tried to sound like a man who still owns something worth offering. This is where we work. Ain't much. Used to be better. You'll sleep in the loft. We eat at dawn and sunset, work in between. That suits you, Clara? For the first time, she looked at him, really looked at him. Her voice was like wind scraping over broken glass. I ain't nobody's slave. And Eli, he didn't argue, didn't claim her, didn't crush her spirit like so many men before had tried to. He just nodded quietly. Well, you ain't, but you do your part, same as me. That was the start of something neither of them understood yet. A war-scarred man hollowed out by loss, and a 12-year-old girl tougher than the dry earth she walked on, but carrying wounds invisible to the eye. Two people who didn't choose each other, but maybe, just maybe, needed each other more than either would admit. And I wonder how many of us have had moments like that, where someone unexpected steps into your life and you don't realize until much later that they weren't just passing through. They were the hinge, the turning point. For Eli, that day in the dusty square with the sound of a gavel and a name whispered into the evening air, that was the moment. Clara wasn't a purchase. She was the beginning of a story he didn't even know he was ready to live again. When morning came, the sun was already heavy in the sky, pressing down on the land like a weight that wouldn't lift. Eli found the girl, Clara, standing by the old well, sleeves rolled up, trying to force the handle down with all her strength. The pump groaned but gave nothing back, just like most things on that ranch. He stepped forward, steady voice, but softer than he meant it to be. It's dried up. We haul from the creek now. 2 miles. Takes a strong back and a stronger will. She didn't complain, didn't even look at him like she was asking if he meant for her to help. She just grabbed a bucket and fell in step beside him. That's how it was in those first days. Silence. Work. More silence. They carried water side by side, walked through the oak trees, past cabins that had been abandoned long before either of them came along. Clara never asked how far, never asked when they could rest. She just kept moving, her small frame carrying a weight that should have bent her, but somehow didn't. And Eli noticed. He noticed how she fed the chickens without anyone telling her, how she gathered eggs, even how she tied up a sagging fence with nothing but twine and a rock. He asked her once, "You ever fix fencing before?" She shook her head. "No." "How'd you know how?" She glanced at him sideways. Watched. You see, some people wait to be taught, and some people just watch closely enough to teach themselves. Clara was the second kind. Maybe that's why Eli didn't push too hard, didn't fill the silence with empty words. He wasn't a man of many words anyway. Still, the girl was cautious. Every move she made felt like it was half challenge, half shield. And Eli, he was no better. Grief had made him a man who built walls instead of bridges. He lost his wife, lost his daughter, and somewhere along the way, he decided it was safer to keep people at a distance. But here's the strange thing about walls. Sometimes the cracks are the most telling part. Sometimes that's where the light sneaks in. One evening, as the sun melted down into the horizon, they sat by the fire. Eli with his tin of beans, Clara wrapped in an old blanket, dirt smudged across her face. He asked, almost casually, "You got people?" She was quiet a long while before answering. "My mom died 2 winters ago. Pa sold me to settle a debt." Eli's jaw clenched, but he didn't say much. He only muttered, "I'm sorry." And Clara, sharp as ever, shot back, "You paid for me too, didn't you? Just like him." That's a line that could have cut a man in two, but Eli didn't flinch. He looked at the fire and said, "I paid to keep you from men worse than me." And for the first time, Clara's eyes softened, not much, but enough to show that maybe, just maybe, she believed him. I can't help but wonder, have you ever met someone who tested you with every glance, every word, but deep down what they really wanted was proof? Proof that you wouldn't turn away? Proof that you'd stay? Later that night, before she climbed to the loft, she asked him why he called her Clara. Eli's voice dropped low. "It was my daughter's name," he said. "The kind of truth that comes out not because you planned it, but because you can't hold it in anymore." She stood there, just a silhouette against the barn light, and whispered back, "All right then, Clara will do." That's how trust began between them.
Not in big gestures, not in sudden declarations, but in small cracks. Her fixing fences with nothing but scraps, him admitting the name wasn't random. Her sharing the loss of her mother, him letting slip the memory of his wife and daughter. It makes me think, maybe that's how trust always works. Not like lightning, but like dawn. It doesn't blind you all at once. It just grows, inch by inch, until you realize the dark isn't as heavy as it used to be. And for Eli and Clara, those first days of hauling water, feeding chickens, and repairing fences were more than chores. They were the fragile beginnings of something neither of them knew how to name yet. Something between survival and family. Something worth holding on to.
The first sign was the wind. It carried that dry, restless edge, like it had fists full of trouble. Eli had lived long enough on the plains to know when the air was warning him, and that day he squinted toward the horizon, uneasy. By noon, the sky wasn't blue anymore. It was orange. Not from rain, but from smoke. Fire. He didn't waste time explaining. He grabbed a shovel, barked orders, and for a second, it felt like the war all over again. His voice hard, urgent, clipped. Clara didn't hesitate either. She was right behind him, her small frame moving quick, eye sharp even as the flames started climbing the ridge across the canyon. Ash drifted down like dirty snow. The crackle of burning grass came closer. Together they hauled water to the barn, doused the roof, shoveled dirt into buckets. Eli moved like a man possessed. But what struck him, what struck me, even just imagining it, was that Clara didn't falter, not once. When the horses refused to leave the gate, panicked by the smell of smoke, Eli cursed under his breath, trying to pull at their reins. But Clara, she stepped forward. Her eyes wide, yes, but her hands steady. She grabbed the halter of one terrified mare, whispered something Eli couldn't hear, and just like that, the animal calmed. Clara gave it a gentle slap and sent it running free. One by one, she did the same for the others. Goats, chickens, even the old mule that had stood stubborn for years. When the fire finally pulled back, licking at the canyon's edge like it was promising to return, Eli and Clara sat outside the barn, their faces blackened with soot, lungs full of smoke. Everything around them smelled of ash, but the barn still stood, the animals still lived. And Eli turned to her, chest heaving, and asked, "You all right?" Clara nodded slowly. "You?" He gave a half smile through the grime. "I've seen worse." He paused. "You were brave." And she was. It makes me wonder, how many times in life do we discover what we're made of only when the fire comes? Not the literal kind, but the kind that tests you, strips you down, forces you to decide, will I run or will I stand? The next morning, Eli found Clara in the barn, cradling a small bird with a burned wing. Its chest rose and fell faintly. He almost said something sharp, "You're wasting time," but the words caught in his throat. She didn't even look up when she whispered, "If it were me, I'd want someone to try." And that's when he surprised even himself. He came back a few minutes later with an old shoebox lined with a rag. "Put it near the hearth. Might help." Clara's head snapped up. "Really?" For a second, the fire in her eyes wasn't defiance. It was gratitude. She said, soft as I've ever imagined her voice, "Thank you." And Eli, gruff as always, only grunted and walked away. But behind his eyes, something shifted, a crack in the wall he'd spent years building around himself. That night, Clara climbed down from the loft with a small leather book. She held it out carefully, like it was the most fragile thing in the world. She asked, "Can you read?" Eli muttered, "I used to, not much anymore." She opened it anyway. The handwriting was faded, the leather worn thin. She began reading aloud. "September 3rd. Still no rain. Papa says the creek's down another inch. Mama says we'll manage. I believe her." She looked up. It was my mother's. Eli's throat tightened. She had carried this piece of her family through everything. Even when she didn't have shoes on her feet, she kept her mother's words. That hit him. And maybe it stirred something in him, too, because later, when Clara was asleep, he sat by the fire with that journal on his lap. Then, for the first time in years, he opened the old box by the hearth. Inside were letters tied with twine, written in his daughter's hand, still sealed, still unread. Can you imagine that? Holding words from someone you loved, someone you lost, and never finding the courage to read them? I think some of us do that in our own ways. We push away memories, lock them in boxes, tell ourselves it's easier not to feel. But silence isn't healing. It's only another kind of wound. Clara didn't need to say much. Just by sitting there, reading her mother's journal aloud, she reminded Eli that words matter, that memories matter, that people you've loved don't just vanish because it hurts to think of them. And so, with her encouragement, Eli finally picked up a pen. His hand shook as he scratched out the first lines of a letter he should have written years ago. Clara, I don't know where to begin. I want you to know I kept every letter. I was too proud to read them then. I was a fool. I named a little girl after you. She's strong, brave. She's showing me how to live again. He didn't sign it. He didn't seal it. He just left it there on the table. Clara found it, read it once, twice, then tucked it into an empty envelope. Tomorrow, she told him, we'll ride to town, we'll post it. I can't help but think, sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in a fire that forces you to fight, in a wounded bird you choose to save, in a journal passed down from mother to daughter, in a child's courage to push you to face the past. For Eli, it came in the form of a 12-year-old girl who had already lost too much and yet carried more strength than most men twice her age. And for Clara, maybe it came in the shape of a weathered old rancher who, against his own nature, began to see her not as a burden, not as a debt, but as family. And if you've ever carried regret so heavy you thought it might break you, maybe this part of the story reminds you. It's never too late to open the letter. Never too late to write one back.
When they rode into town, the air felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was just the stares. People always stared at Clara. She didn't look like she belonged to anyone, and in a place where ownership was often mistaken for identity, that unsettled folks. And then, from across the street, came a voice Eli hadn't hoped to hear again. Daniel Croft, the man who once tried to outbid him for Clara. He tipped his hat, sneered, and said loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Little girl, still working out that debt?" Eli stepped forward, his jaw set, eyes cold as steel. "She's not a debt. She's a person." Croft smirked, but before Eli could say more, Clara moved. She stepped out from behind him, her chin lifted, her voice carrying like a whip crack. "You didn't win." Croft blinked. "What?" "You didn't win," she said again, louder this time, her voice rising with every syllable. "I'm not for sale." The street went silent. People turned, watching this barefoot girl with dirt on her skirt and fire in her eyes. For a moment, it was as if the whole town saw her not as something fragile, and not as property, but as a force that couldn't be caged. Croft flushed, spat into the dirt, and stormed away. And I think about that moment often. How many of us have spent years letting someone else's definition of us stick until one day we finally say, enough? It's not just about shouting it in the street, it's about reclaiming your own name, your own self. Clara did it at 12 years old. How many grown men and women still can't? Back on the ranch, something in her began to bloom. It started small, just sketches on scraps of wood, rough outlines of the land, a crooked fence line, the shadow of a bird. But Eli saw them, and instead of brushing them off like a man too proud to care, he leaned in.
He told her, "That's your voice." Not a compliment, not even encouragement, just recognition. She began painting every day, on barn doors, on bits of discarded lumber, even on the backs of letters Eli hadn't answered. Her strokes were raw, bold, sometimes messy, but they carried truth. Fire, storms, faces she half remembered, and with every brush she lifted, she reclaimed something stolen from her. I remember once standing in front of a child's drawing taped to a fridge. The lines were jagged, the colors too bright, but what I saw was freedom. Kids don't draw to impress, they draw because their heart can't hold it in. That's what Clara was doing, except she wasn't a child anymore. She was rebuilding herself, line by line, color by color. And Eli, this hardened rancher who thought his life had ended years ago, made a decision. One evening, while they shelled peas under the dim lantern light, he cleared his throat. "I want to change the deed," he said. Clara looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I want to put your name on it. The land, the house, the garden. It's yours." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't want to let fall. "But I'm not—" He cut her off. "You are. Family. Maybe not by blood, but by fire. And that holds deeper." There's something about those words that lingers. Family by fire, by trial, by the things you survived together. Isn't that often stronger than blood alone? Not long after, a letter came from Kansas. His daughter, his real daughter, Rose, the one he'd pushed away after his wife died. She wrote that she'd gotten Eli's note, that she cried when she read it, that she wanted to see him. She wanted him to meet his grandson. And so, it happened. One July afternoon, a carriage rolled up the dusty road. Eli stood frozen as Rose stepped down, her face carrying his own features in softer lines. Behind her, a boy of 7 with wide eyes taking in the ranch, the barn, the garden that Clara had coaxed back to life. "Papa," Rose whispered, and the years melted. They held each other, awkward at first, then tight like lifelines. And when she turned to Clara, she smiled through tears. "You're the one who kept him alive." Clara shook her head. "He saved me." But the truth? They saved each other. That night, under the stars, the boy Matthew chased fireflies. Rose sat with her father, and Clara played a fiddle she'd dug out from an old chest. The sound was rough, but it carried through the night like healing itself. And I think of that scene often. A man who thought he'd lost everything, a girl who thought she belonged nowhere, a daughter who thought her father had forgotten her, all gathered around one fire, proving that broken people can make something whole again. Clara wasn't just taken in, she was claimed, not as property, not as charity, but as family. The kind forged in fire, stitched together by survival, and watered by hope. And maybe that's the lesson here, that redemption doesn't look like riding off into the sunset alone. Sometimes it looks like staying, planting, painting, putting someone else's name on the deed and saying, "You belong here. You always did."
By the time Eli admitted it out loud, his body was already slowing, his breath already shorter than it should have been. They were sitting on the porch one morning, the kind of quiet where even the birds seemed to hold back their song, and he said it as if he were talking to himself. "I think I'd like to see the ocean." Clara blinked. The ocean? For a man who had spent his life tied to dust and drought, the thought of endless water felt almost like a dream. She asked him if he was serious. He nodded, slow and steady, and whispered, "Always wanted to. They say it's loud, endless, like thunder you can touch." She didn't hesitate. "Then we'll go." So they left the ranch in October, left it in the hands of a neighbor boy who had always admired Clara's garden. Their wagon carried little more than a quilt, some jars of jam, a couple of paint brushes, and a folded letter from Rose wishing them safe travels. The journey was long and slow, winding through Kansas wheat fields, over the Ozarks, across roads that cut through forests, turning red and gold. Eli told stories along the way, about his first horse,
about the storm that once carried a cow 2 miles, about the time he was lost in the woods for 3 days and survived on dandelions and sassafras. Clara laughed, really laughed, and it struck her how rare that sound had been in her own life. There's something about road dust and open sky that pulls stories out of a person, isn't there? Maybe you felt that too, on a long drive when the silence feels safe enough to confess things you'd forgotten you carried. They reached the sea in late November. Clara had imagined it 100 different ways, but nothing prepared her for the sound. The roar of waves colliding with rock, the air sharp with salt, the horizon stretching farther than any land could promise. Eli stood at the edge of the beach, his boots sinking into the wet sand, his arms crossed tight. He didn't say a word for a long while. And then, almost to the wind, "I wish I'd seen this with her." Clara stepped beside him, the waves breaking at their feet. "You're seeing it now, for both of you." He nodded, and when the wind caught his hat and carried it out to sea, he just let it go, smiled even. They stayed in a small house overlooking the water. Clara painted each morning, the ocean shifting in her hands, sometimes gray and violent, sometimes blue and endless. Eli sat by the window, reading the old letters from Rose, watching gulls cut the sky. Until one morning, Clara woke to find him still in his chair, coffee cold in his cup, eyes closed, at peace. The funeral was simple. Clara carved her grief into something solid. On a pine box, she painted a seashell in blue and gold, a streak of green grass curling through the waves. On the stone, she wrote, "Elijah Morgan, burned but not broken. He planted hope where none should grow." And then she came home. The ranch waited, quiet but alive. The soil was tired but breathing. The barn carried both their coats on the wall. And the garden, well, it was ready for hands again. Clara dug her fingers into that dirt, and in doing so, she rooted herself there. Over time, children began to wander in. At first just curious, then hungry to learn. Mothers brought seeds to trade. Old men stopped by, looking for someone who understood silence better than most. Clara opened the barn as a place to paint, a place to heal. She called it Ash's Roots, and on the sign she painted a girl standing on blackened earth, green shoots rising at her feet. She taught young girls who had been broken by the world how to seek color again, how to turn pain into brushstrokes, how to take something charred and make it bloom. I think about that often, how healing rarely comes from forgetting. More often it comes from creating, from putting your hurt into something that can breathe outside of you. Word spread. A reporter came, wrote an article called "The Girl Who Rose from Ash." She was invited to the city, offered a gallery, asked to publish a book. She turned them all down. She said, "I've already told my story. It's written in the soil." And I admire that more than I can say. In a world that wants to package pain, sell it, and move on, Clara chose roots over fame. She stayed with the land, with the garden, with the children who came to her not for spectacle, but for shelter. Because for her, the ranch wasn't just a place. It was proof that even the burned can bloom again. And maybe that's the lesson Eli left behind too. You don't always get to choose the fires that come for you, but you do get to choose what rises after. Clara chose to rise, and in doing so, she carried him with her, not in the ashes, but in the roots, not in what was lost, but in what she grew.
When I think about Clara's story, it still amazes me how far she traveled without ever leaving the land she came to call home. She began as a barefoot girl, standing silent on an auction block, treated like nothing more than a debt to be settled. And yet, by the time the years had done their carving, she stood as a woman who painted fire into color, who opened her barn to the broken, who taught others that even scorched earth can bloom again. She became free, not because someone handed her freedom, but because she chose it, claimed it, and lived it. She became an artist, yes, but more than that, she became a healer. And Eli was the kind of man you might have written off at the start, a war veteran, alone on a dying ranch, carrying grief so heavy it bent his back before age ever could. He thought his story had already ended. But then came Clara, And through her stubborn defiance, her quiet strength, she forced him to pick up the pieces he'd left behind. With her, he found a way back to being a father, even if not by blood. He found forgiveness for his past, for his pride. And when the time came, he left the world not in bitterness, but in peace. That's rare. That's grace. I wonder, have you ever felt burned down to ash? Not just hurt, but hollowed out so badly you thought nothing good could ever grow from you again? Maybe you've lost someone you loved, or lost yourself in the wreckage of mistakes you couldn't take back. That's what this story whispers to me. You are not finished. Even when life sets fire to everything you thought you were, there's still something in you that can rise, like green shoots breaking through blackened soil. Clara and Eli's lives remind me that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's fire that binds us, or pain survived together, or the simple choice to stand beside someone when the world has already walked away. They built something out of ruin, a home, a garden, a kind of love that didn't need to be named to be real. And maybe that's the greatest redemption, not erasing the scars, but letting them become the soil where something new can grow. So when I think of Clara, I don't see the girl who was sold for $5. I see the woman standing in her barn, surrounded by children painting their way out of silence, her canvases alive with fire and light. And when I think of Eli, I don't see the lonely rancher who thought his life was over. I see the man who finally laid his burdens down by the sea, knowing he had planted hope where no one thought it could take root. Burned but not broken. Those words carved on Eli's stone could just as well be written on Clara's life, and maybe, if we're honest, on ours too. Because no matter how deep the loss, no matter how fierce the fire, there is always the chance, if we're willing, to rise again, to love again, to find family again, even in the fragments we thought were gone forever. And that's why this story stays with me. It isn't just about them. It's about us, about the way we carry our wounds, and the way we choose what to do with them. We can let them define us, or we can let them remind us that we are still here, still breathing, still capable of planting something new in the ashes. Because in the end, the fire doesn't win. We do. If you're still here, thank you. Not every story needs a hero. Some just need to be heard. And if this one meant something to you, share it. Let it plant something.